let's start.
So good afternoon and welcome to this GASI special event, online exhibition with Maurice Nitsun. My name is Marit Joffe-Milstein and I will host this event with the backup support of my colleague and friend Peter Zelaskowski from the Management Committee. We will start with Maurice Nitsun's presentation for 45 minutes. After the presentation, there will be breakout rooms, groups in which you will be invited to share your impressions and associations. Then we will take 15 minutes short break while the space will be open to you. That will be followed by an open discussion with all of you. We hope you'll all stay with us for the whole event. Some words of you, Maurice, although probably most of the people know you. Maurice Nitsun is a clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, and group analyst who recently retired from the NHS after 51 years of service. He is in private practice at the Fitzrovia Group Analytic practice in London and a training group analyst at the IGA. In 2015, he was awarded the Royal College of Psychiatrists President's Medal for services to mental health, including group psychotherapy. He is the author of 3 groups, very important: the anti-group, the group is an object of desire, and beyond the anti-group. As an artist, he has painted for many decades and has held regular exhibitions of his work in London galleries. His work is in collections across the world. Hello, Maurice. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, thanks. And I'd like to welcome everyone here. As I said earlier, there are people I know very well, people I know quite well, and a few people I don't know at all, but a warm welcome to everyone.
So I think people know you mostly more as a group analyst. And for me, as an expressive art therapist myself and a group analyst, I wonder if you can start by telling us a bit about your artistic side or the way it developed besides.
Yeah, okay. I started painting seriously when I was about 19 or 20 in South Africa, which is where I come from. And at that time, I also started studying psychology at university. So there's been a parallel development. And I think it was in 1966, I won quite an important prize for painting in South Africa that enabled me to study abroad in painting. And it was one of the reasons I came to London at that point. That was at the end of 68. And I was in some conflict about that because I also had come to study psychotherapy further, but I managed to do both with some difficulty, keeping them rather separate all that time. And what's been very positive and exciting about the last few years is that it has felt to me that the two are really coming together. And I hope that in today's presentation, you'll see that, or I'll be able to communicate that to you, the kind of marriage between art and psychology, or art and psychotherapy.
Great. So you can start sharing maybe the first slide with the first drawing. And I will ask you if you could tell us something about the background to your paintings and how did you come to paint this series?
Just hang on a sec. Can everyone see the image on the screen? The deserted city? Good. And you can see me as well and hear me? Excellent. Good. So I'll get started. Marit, you asked me about how I came to do this series.
Yeah.
It's quite a long story, but I think it obviously has to do with the virus, with COVID, and with being in lockdown. And I'll come back to that because there's quite a lot to share with you about that. But to say also that it represents a change in my subject matter, because for many years in my painting, I had painted landscapes, seascapes, often in Mediterranean countries, usually in reflecting the warmth and the light of Mediterranean countries, which I loved. And often people commented on the color in my work. But about 2 or 3 years ago, I found that my painting subject matter, and to some extent my style, was changing. And it came about particularly with a series of paintings of dolls, of old vintage dolls that I did. And a lot of people saw those paintings. And I had 2 or 3 group discussions about the paintings, which I found very, very revealing and very, very stimulating, both to myself and to the people in the groups. And it made me aware that there was something in my painting, or certainly the way I was painting, that could evoke a different quality or a different conversation from anything I was used to in relation to my painting. And it was on that basis that when I went into lockdown with the virus, I was keen to do my next series of paintings should reflect that in some way. Above all, what I felt was that it was imagery, the power of the image to evoke feelings, reflections, and associations in people, particularly in groups. I found that people's responses, their resonances, their associations made for a very rich way of understanding not just the paintings, but also the themes, so that in the doll paintings, a great deal about childhood was opened up through the discussion. So that's what I'm hoping people will find interesting today, beyond, or not just the subject matter, but the actual images and what they evoke in you, what they stimulate in you. So if that's enough, Marit, I think I'll get going with the first, the next slide. Can people, no, you can't see this, can you? I can't move. Oh, you can, okay. Yes, there's the next one, which is just to say I'm the presenter and Marit is the convener. And now, COVID has affected all of us. All our lives have in some ways been changed. And we all have our particular stories to tell. And I have my story, which I am going to share with you, not because it's an exceptional story, but because it is interconnected with the paintings. And so I need to share quite a bit with you. And the story starts in New York, because you can probably see that that is a scene of a very crowded street in New York. And I was in New York in the first week of March, about the 1st to the 8th of March, just before the virus really hit the town in a very big way. And you can probably remember those early scenes of how the streets of New York were very empty. It was very eerie. Everything looked barren and empty. Everything came to a standstill. Now, I had gone to New York to attend the Congress of the American Group Psychotherapy Association, which is where I did the dolls presentation. I presented the dolls, a lecture about the doll paintings. And there was a group there as well, which was a very powerful group in my experience. Other people also felt that. And just to describe the setting to you, this Congress took place in a large conference hotel in the heart of Manhattan. There were hundreds and thousands of people around. And don't forget, this was at the beginning of March. And there was an amazing amount of physical contact between people. People were hugging, kissing, embracing. People were packed in halls, listening to lectures. And on the last night, there was a rather wild, riotous party. And that was the atmosphere of the conference. And I think it's true to say that quite often at conferences, there is a kind of manic excitement, or maybe a manic anxiety, which in this case could have concealed, could have obscured some underlying anxiety about what was happening in the world and the threat that was looming all around us. Well, I came back to London on the 9th of March, and soon afterwards, I discovered that many people who had been at the conference in New York were falling ill. There was an email chain in which person after person said they thought they had symptoms, or they were diagnosed, or they were being treated. And the anxiety and the tension and the panic really grew just in this email group. And I realized how vulnerable I was myself. I felt, I'm not sure that I think I was more vulnerable than most people because of my age. I'm in my late 70s. And also I have an underlying lung condition that could become very serious. And not long after I came to London, my physician in London gave me strict instructions to isolate. And that I did immediately. Now, I think I was okay. I think I had a mild version of COVID, which I won't go into now, except that I had an antibody test a few weeks ago, which was positive and suggested that I had had COVID. But apart from that, I had survived, I was well, and I realized that I now faced months probably of lockdown and had to do something with all the time. So I settled down to some serious painting, and that's when the series of paintings, The Deserted City, emerged. Before I get onto the paintings, and I hope this is all interesting to you, the background to the paintings, but I'd like to stop and consider what it was, how we could understand the dissociation or the seeming lack of awareness in these very large groups of what was happening, of what was so very imminent and actually happening at the time. And it's hard to be sure about this. You know, is it that, I think it is that the whole idea of epidemic or pandemic was inconceivable. It could happen to others, but it can't happen to us. It's out there somewhere. Or was it a deliberate way of ignoring what was happening? Or maybe a deeper process of denial that is embedded in the whole of society? Perhaps we're prone to deny what we don't want to face. And at this point, I want to mention to you the work of Ernest Becker on the denial of death. Some people, I think, are aware of this book. Not everyone. I think it's one of the great classics of the 20th century. He won the Pulitzer Prize for this book, and it's a book that I come to very often because I think it's very wise. And he really puts the death at the center of civilization in the sense of our symbolic interactions and our whole culture. And this is what he says. Can you all see the screen? Human beings are mortal, and we know it. Our sense of vulnerability and mortality gives rise to anxiety, even terror. And so we devise strategies to escape knowledge of our mortality and vulnerability, our anxious awareness of it. The denial of death is one of the basic drives of individual behavior and is reflected throughout human culture. In various ways, we inculcate the belief that we are permanent, invulnerable, eternal. This can have adverse consequences at both personal and social levels. It involves a failure to mourn loss and a deep but fragile quest to maintain an impossible illusion. Okay, now, there's a question here, and I'll go into this quite quickly and then get onto the paintings about groups. How does this affect groups? Is it that in groups that the fear, the terror is amplified because we know that most experiences are intensified in groups? Is it also that the denial is amplified in groups? Is there a way in which groups collude with a denial? I'm thinking here about large group processes. And there's another paper that I'm very keen on, which has the odd title of Group Thanatropics. Thanatropics is a word that the writer Jeffrey Kaufman actually invented, because I haven't found the word anywhere else. It's not in the dictionary, but I think he means fear of death, or certainly the phenomenon of death. And he puts death at the center of all groups and regards our whole civilization as, sorry, not so much our civilization, but a particular group at hand, as dealing with death unconsciously. And of course, sometimes it is conscious, but he sees the very process of groups and group development as linked to the degree to which loss, death can be recognized and mourned. And I'm saying that here because I think we will be in groups later, and we'll be talking about groups, and this may be a theme that you wish to explore. Of course, there's a lot being written about annihilation anxiety in groups and the defenses against it. And I'm hoping that Earl Hopper is in the audience. I'm not sure if he is. He told me that he would be, because of course he's written a great deal about this. I have also written about it, but again, it's a theme that we may be able to come back to. So enough of my verbal chat, and now I'm going to go on to the paintings. Now, that's the first painting I'm showing you, and you may be able to see that it's the full version of the smaller painting that is on the title page. Can you see this section here? Can you follow my cursor, the arrow? It's yes. This section that is blown up on the title page of this presentation. And throughout my showing you the paintings, I will, from time to time, show you the whole painting and a detail of the painting, because it's often the detail that conveys a particular image or shows the textures and the colors of the painting. But the point about this is that it's not New York, as you can see, it's Europe. And this is important because I found that as the whole COVID phenomenon unfolded, I was particularly struck and affected by the images of European towns, particularly in northern Italy and Spain, France, places I knew and loved, places I had visited, often places I had painted in a very different way from the way I've painted them here, warmer, lighter paintings. And when I started these paintings, actually, I wasn't initially aware of their link to COVID, but it soon became apparent to me that I was painting something darker, something more about decay, something about possible disintegration. I was painting the towns that I was so fond of, but in a rather different way. And I think it reflected some anxiety in me about what was happening to these European towns. Of course, the town itself, the fabric of the town, wasn't literally decaying, but I think that the sense of decay in the architecture, the buildings and so on, was a metaphor for me of what was happening to the human beings in the town. So that really illustrates the mood in which I was painting. And the colors also were different from the colors that I usually have previously used in my work. They were more somber, there were more grays and browns, some rather acidy whites and so on. So I'm going to move on to the next painting. Just by the way, the images were all taken from drawings, sketches I had done earlier, or photographs. And I also researched the images of Europe and used some of those as well. So let me move on from there. This is this is a town on the outskirts, I think, of an Italian city. I'm not going to name the places because in a sense it doesn't matter particularly where exactly it was. It's more to convey the feeling of the place. And you're looking up at this town, and what I felt as decaying buildings and so on. I might just add to this that I've been aware for some time of all the writing and the commentary about the collapse of the West and the collapse of Europe, that Europe was no longer the center of the world, it was ancient, it was old, outmoded, etc., etc. And I think particularly with Brexit, which I personally was very against, I was worried about losing my connection with Europe. So I think to some extent the paintings reflect that sense of loss, that sense of anxiety. The loss, I think, paralleling what was going on at a human level. But I want also to comment here, to take a detail of the painting, which is this house, and to mention that I've always been interested in painting houses. And I've done a lot of houses in my time, mainly in Europe, in fact, and also in the UK, Scotland, Ireland, and so on. I'm fascinated by houses. You might find me walking down any street, peering into people's houses, looking through the windows. I'm curious about what people do with their spaces, the light in the house, and the dark, the way people arrange their furniture, and so on. And at a psychological level, I think it's something about the house being a home, the house being a container. And of course, this was a very important part of lockdown for most people, and it still is, because many of us are again in lockdown, or certainly in restricted conditions. The home became a refuge. It's where you could go to hide from the terrible things that were happening all around you. Thank God for your house, the comforts of your house. But at the same time, it became, for many people, a prison because they felt so confined. People in apartment blocks, people without gardens, people who couldn't go outside. And so there's this curious paradox of what is safe and containing is also imprisoning and stifling. And that's something I've been interested in through this whole lockdown experience. And I think that my paintings reflect that, at least to some extent. Now, going back to this painting, it went through two phases, two versions of this painting. This was the first one. Can you see in the sky? Initially, there was nothing in the sky. It was a kind of empty sky. I decided to put a bird in. So I hope you can see the bird there. But I then decided that the bird was too vague. It was too insignificant. And I wanted to do something stronger. And I did this, which is, I added this image of a bird in a very large way. I painted this very quickly. The rest of the painting, which is, by the way, a very large painting, it's the largest one in the whole series. It's about 4 or 5 foot by 3 foot, if you can translate that into, I'm not sure what that is in metrics. The rest of the painting was difficult and took me a long time. The bird I painted quickly, and I thought, this is wrong. It doesn't really look like a bird. But the more I looked at it, the more I thought, you know what, I'm going to keep the bird as it is, because it's the very ambiguity of the bird, of what it is, that I think is interesting, because it doesn't necessarily look like a bird. It could be, and I'll show this to you in greater detail, it looks like it has an animal head or a human head, perhaps. And what is it? Is it a bird? Is it an angel? Is it an angel of death? Is it an angel of mercy? I even noticed quite recently, and you may laugh at this, that it looked as if this creature was wearing a mask. Can you see the mask? As if there was something prophetic about this, because this was a point quite early on where people were not yet wearing masks in any kind of great degree. Now, I want to bring in here some a bit of literature, because after I did this painting, after I did the bird, I started reading for the first time Camus' book, The Plague, which I think most people have probably read. I hadn't read it. And for those of you who don't know the book, I'll just give you a summary that it takes place in an Algerian town called Oran in the year of 1947. And it's narrated by the doctor of the town. And it's very much about a town totally succumbing to a plague, to a virus. And much of what it describes is similar to the experience we've all had. How initially there was a lot of denial. Gradually, people could no longer deny. The numbers of illness and death increased, then increased exponentially. The whole town went into a terrified lockdown. Shops closed. There was no transport, no meeting of people at all, and terror swept through the streets. It does have, some of you will remember, what one could call a happy ending, because towards the end of the book, a virus is discovered. They've been working on it all along in the town or in the country. And rather suddenly, actually, I think a bit too suddenly, it changes and the town is released, and people, very relieved, go back to their ordinary lives. Now, an important character in the book is a priest called Panaloo. And Panaloo, quite early on the book, gives a sermon to people in his church, which is a very stern sermon because he presents the virus. He tells people that it's a punishment for their wrongdoing, for their indulgence in life, and for their turning away from God. And it has a very stern, autocratic feeling about it, this lecture. And later in the book, I think it's not in his talk, but a bit later, he describes it as a kind of visitation on the town, like something encircling the town, almost like a creature, a malign creature. And when I read it, I immediately connected it with this bird, if it is a bird. And that was one of the reasons I decided to keep the bird as it is, because I like the coincidence. I like being associated in Camus with my mind and with this image. And I'll come back to the story of this particular priest later. So let me move on from there. Now, that follows a series of paintings that are of streets and buildings in which I'm trying to illustrate some of the emptiness of the streets. The buildings, curiously, often have a reddish warm color, which for me I associated with fire, oddly enough. There wasn't any particular fire, but even at the end of this town, you can see there's a red streak, a red object that could be a fire, could be a tower. I left it rather ambiguous. I think I'm going to go through these quite quickly because I'm aware that time is getting short, and I fear Marit coming down on me with her warning about the end of the talk. So I think I'll have to speed through these quite quickly. But basically, I'm trying to convey a sense of a decaying buildings, decaying homes. Windows and doors are emphasized. I'm not going to tell you too much about the imagery and how I saw it, because I want to leave it to you and your imaginations and to bring in some of your own images. Another town with this actually reminded me of France and a Van Gogh painting with a street, a road leading nowhere. A tower, maybe the tower in the first of these paintings I showed you, with a red background, an imploded tower, a town with an abandoned red car and a vivid sunset, rather sinister sunset. Some of the buildings I painted were more stately, statuesque buildings, like in the squares, the rather majestic squares of some of these beautiful towns. But also conveying, I think, something about imprisonment. I felt that quite a lot of these buildings might convey something about the stifling sense of being inside the building, not just the deserted streets, which we all saw, but also the experience of being inside the buildings. That's a close-up of the last one. Then some of the paintings, I was surprised to find had a washed out, whiter, paler, chalky quality. And I thought, well, that's not quite right. That's not what I associate with Southern Europe. But I decided to leave this color because it felt to me that there was a ghostly quality about these particular buildings. This is a detail of the last one. That's another one of the more ghostly, paler towns. And that's a detail of that particular painting. I paint largely with a palette knife, by the way. I'm not sure if you're aware of knife work in painting, but I use a variety of different sizes of palette knives, some very big. And I scrape on the paint a lot, scrape it off. And do it in layers, and I'm very interested in the textures of paint. So I'm enlarging this detail to give you a sense of that. That's another one of the white buildings, which I think is quite stark in the atmosphere it conveys. And that's rather different because I think that was from a sketch I did in Corsica years ago of what could be an apartment block or several very vertical buildings with a sense of probably a lot of people living there, windows, doors, balconies, but all the people contained within that building, a bit like a prison block. Now, this is different because I also did a series of figure studies. I'm not going to show most of these to you, but I had in the past done a lot of paintings of figures, usually of the poorer people, the peasants and so on, in these European towns or rural villages and so on. And I'm showing you just one or two of these. I've chosen this woman because I think there's something about her and the expression which is ambiguous as well. And I think it would be interesting for you to consider what she's conveying, what's she looking at, what does she feel? And this is a close-up of her face, which I think is interesting in terms of the line work and the textures of her face. Then this is a very different painting, which came from a photograph, which I saw at the time of the outbreak in Europe. And it actually was of a homeless couple lying on a park bench. But I remember thinking, what happens to people like this? It's hard enough for people who have a home, to deal with the confinement and the claustrophobic sense. What about people who don't have a home, living in this awful, threatening world? I didn't have the answer. It was just a question in my mind. And that's a close-up of their heads. Now, these came more recently, where I decided I wanted to paint people wearing masks, because I became very aware of this at some point as I was wearing a mask more and more, and everyone around me was, and masks became mandatory. And these were taken from images I saw in reports, often in photographs, in newspapers, and so on. This was of a doctor standing at the entrance of a COVID ward. And I remember being struck by the look of fear in his eyes and a sense of how on earth can I deal with what I see. These are three heads wearing masks. Not sure what the noise is. Anyway, these are three heads that I invented. I created these heads as images for this painting. And then this is what has become a common scene of people in groups, in crowds, all wearing masks now, and how much this has become the new normal. such a commonplace, so much part of our lives, to the extent that I find myself wondering if I'll ever see people's faces again as I go out on the streets. You see foreheads, eyes, but not anything below that. And it's so much part of the landscape of our lives now. And then in this series, finally, this painting, which was of someone wearing a mask. I think it was also a health professional. And the mask he was wearing had a hard section over the mouth, as some masks have. But it was white in the picture. However, when I painted it, I noticed that I had painted it as if a mouth. And at first I was going to change it and correct it. And then I thought, no, I'm leaving it because it's saying something. And maybe it's saying something from my unconscious, or something I want to express about this whole experience. And I decided to leave it, and it conveys for me a scream, someone shouting or screaming, conveying the kind of distress so many people have felt about this experience. And quite soon I had an art historical association, which is that I thought of the Scream by Munch, which is a painting that probably most of you know. I read somewhere that it is the second most well-known painting in all of art, the first one being the Mona Lisa. And I think it's quite interesting that the most well-known painting is an enigmatic woman, actually in a European environment, and the next most well-known is a man screaming. And of course, it's become well-known partly because it's such an iconic expression of the feeling of alienation and anguish at the end of what was the 19th century, or yes, the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century. It's interesting that at this particular time, we have our own anguish. In some ways, a different sort of anguish, and yet is it? And I started reading more about Munch. I knew a bit about him, but I came across, oh, by the way, this is Munch's Scream. And there were several versions of this, many versions, in fact. That's a graphic black and white version, and that's a detail from the well-known color version. But reading more about Munch, I came across this, which I found really interesting. It was in an article about his painting, and it's from his own diary. It's a quote in his diary. And he says, I was walking along the road with two friends. I felt a gust of melancholy. Suddenly the sky turned a bloody red. I can't see my whole screen here because of your faces hiding the screen. But anyway, it's something about the flame-colored sky hung like blood and soared over the black-blue fjord and the city. My friends went on. I stood there trembling with anxiety, and I felt, now this I can't see myself here, but I think it says, I experienced a what?
And felt a vast infinite scream through nature.
Oh yes, and felt a vast infinite scream through nature. I thought this was very interesting indeed, because he's saying here, it's not so much his own scream, it's the scream of nature that he is expressing. And that really struck a chord with me, because I realized how much I had felt in these few months, and still do, a kind of scream of nature, that something is so wrong in our world. And in my own thinking, COVID is in some way linked to climate change. And I see them both very much as threatening the world as we know it. I even think there may be, I don't know how, but some connection between COVID and climate change. But it was something about the quality of that scream in Munch's experience and in his painting that has stayed with me, and that I wanted to share with you.
We have still 5 more minutes, Maurice.
Okay, I think I'll probably get through this if I can. A cathedral, and just to say that I did a few paintings that had religious themes, not that I'm religious, but that I was interested in this whole idea of belief systems and how people use belief systems to understand trauma and understand large-scale catastrophes like the one that we're dealing with. That's a derelict church. But just to come back to the priest dies. He doesn't die of the priest in the book by Camus, The Plague. He doesn't die of the virus, interestingly enough. He dies, it seems, because of a shattered spirit, because as the virus just grips the entire town and so many people die, his own spirit is broken, his own belief system falters, he becomes very depressed, very demoralized. And in the end, when he dies, you have the sense of a broken man. And I thought it was an interesting commentary on the place of religion and the difficulty of holding on to faith in states of such threat and difficulty. Just finally, a little still life, very different from anything else, that where the flowers, I realized afterwards, are probably dying, where I felt I cannot get away from the theme, the feeling of this. Not that I want to be morbid at all, because this is so much a reality. I have to say, though, just very briefly, that oddly enough, I've always been very frightened of death myself. But through this experience of lockdown and having to face so much death, so many images of death, so much anxiety about death, I actually feel better about it. I feel I've come to terms with it. Maybe I've been desensitized. Perhaps I've also just realized that it's so part of the universal crowd, and I'm one of them. No better, no worse. And in that sense, it actually oddly has helped me. And then finally, just to say that although I think I've come through this okay, and I hope I remain okay, that we face a very difficult world with very many unanswered questions, particularly now with Corona spiking all over the world, particularly in Europe and various countries that some of you belong to. And just to say how difficult this is, but that also for those of us who work in groups, it's a very important time, I think, because we can do very, very good group work at this time and help people. I find in my own groups that never before have they been so cohesive or committed, because it's so important and people experience it, value so much being able to come from their isolation into a shared space where they can talk about all of these things. So I want to end really with that message, that the work we do is good work, and there's a lot more of it for us to do, especially if we can be courageous and face death and deal with death openly, not deny it, and deal with loss and the mourning that goes with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.